Our first dialogue today is on electoral reform and the Presidential Commission on Election Administration. Our speakers are Valerie Ervin and John Fortier. Valerie is Executive Director of the Center for Working Families, which engages in policy development, research, and public education. She served on the Montgomery County Council from 2006 to 2014, where she was my representative, and was its president in 2011. John has run the democracy program at the Bipartisan Policy Center since 2011. Prior to joining BPC, John was research fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he served as the principal contributor to the AEI Brookings Election Reform Project. He's the author of Absentee and Early Voting Trends, Promises, and Perils, and After the People Vote, A Guide to the Electoral College. Thank you, Valerie and John.
Thanks. Good to be here. Hi, everyone. I'm Valerie, and I live up the road in Montgomery County, Maryland, where I, a year ago, retired from my position on the Montgomery County Council, where I was the first African-American woman to ever serve. It's kind of hard to say those words out loud, but this is part of the conversation we're going to have today about democracy and voting and why it is so incredibly important to expand the democracy. So I am now at the Center for Working Families, where I am the executive director. And when I came on board last year, one of the first things I said to Dan Cantor, my partner in crime, I said, why aren't we doing more on voter rights and voter registration? And at that time, he said, well, that's really not what we focus on. Well, fast forward to now, we are really focusing on it. I have a son who's 27 years old, and we went and saw the movie Selma recently. And my son said to me, Mom, things are pretty much the same, aren't they? And in so many ways, it is disheartening to sit next to your son and watch a movie about the terrible things that happened in American history around the right to vote. And here we are many years later, and we have seen the rollbacks of many of the rights that so many of us fought so hard for in the civil rights movement. And I always like to say I barely missed the civil rights movement by a few years. I'm 57, so when the 1965 Voting Rights Act was passed, I was only 8 years old, and I like to say my civil rights movement is happening right now. And so I think we're going to have just a free-flowing conversation back and forth about what we each do in the world and why it's important, and how we see policy changes around this topic to be so incredibly important in our country right now. So I will stop and we'll trade off a little bit.
Great. Thank you, Valerie. I think what we'd like to do in this dialogue is, I think all of us, two of us, the others who will hear here, all of you are working on these issues of democracy and voting in various ways, and express what we're doing and sort of have some back and forth and engage with each other. I thank all the sponsors here. I do want to push back on one thing as a New England Patriots fan, that deflating the ball comment, it wasn't necessary, but anyway, we all feel good about that. So just to back up, if you were here a year ago, the President's Commission on Election Administration had just announced some recommendations. And again, just to back up a little further than that, if you remember, after the 2012 election, President Obama announced in several fora, including the State of the Union, that he was troubled by one particular problem, that there were significant lines at some voting places around the country. But then also, when appointing this commission, thought about the broader set of problems related to how we run elections, election administration. And of course, we have all sorts of issues there, and some of them are controversial between the two political parties. But the way the president proceeded in creating this commission was to appoint his own lawyer, Bob Bauer, who had been an election lawyer and also White House counsel, and then Mitt Romney's lawyer, Ben Ginsberg, who had been also active in many other Republican campaigns. And then to actually find some very, very strong election administrators, because as all of you know, election administration is not primarily done at the federal level. So we had state level secretaries of state, election directors, as well as county election directors. And that group spent a good amount of time going around the country, hearing about what they wanted to focus on in a variety of areas, but essentially had some ground rules. They weren't going to talk about federal legislation. There's some to talk about there, but again, a lot of the meat of what is done in elections and running them is at the state or local level. And they were going to take some very big hot button issues off the table. You can think of them, voter ID, or Republicans aren't always so thrilled about same-day registration. There are definitely some issues that would cause some controversy. But within that, we found there was a lot to be done that both parties can agree on. And so the commission made some recommendations, and we at the Bipartisan Policy Center, who had worked with them, are now working with them to implement and to push forward further in these areas. And I guess I'll just lay out quickly 4 big priorities. We have more than that. We have many recommendations, but 4 big priorities that we are trying to focus on, and primarily focusing on by partnering with states, partnering with counties and other local jurisdictions to improve their election administration. One, mentioned earlier, registration issues, but in particular, moving towards the online registration, moving towards more effective ways of sharing registration data across states to improve both the access and accuracy of people who are allowed to vote. And then also improving the way that the Department of Motor Vehicles works, both in registering people, but also in interacting with election officials. There's a lot of real workmanlike work to be done that ultimately would vastly improve the accuracy and the comprehensiveness of our voter registration lists. 2, the Commission noted the big trend towards more voting before Election Day. And while the Commission doesn't focus on one particular mode of it, we are really pushing or helping a certain number of states who are looking to move towards doing more early voting or more effective early voting, or voting in they call it sort of a vote center concept, where you can choose your location of where to vote. All of those things have gone forward in some states, but there's certainly plenty of states who have not moved much at all or really want to improve those processes. A third one I would point to is the one that animated the beginning of the Commission, and that is thinking about how jurisdictions really are measuring and then trying to dissipate long lines on Election Day or early voting centers. And there, again, we think there's a lot to be done at the local and county level. We have partnerships with a number of counties around the country, one of them in the room today, Cameron Quinn of Fairfax County, where we are working, first of all, to just measure lines. I mean, that sounds like we should do that everywhere, but when this problem came up, people looked around and said, well, where were all the lines? Well, we knew where some of them were. There were news accounts, but we certainly didn't have a list of each polling place and what times of day you had lines. And then going further into trying to break down in some of these communities where some of the problems are. Is it at the registration point? Is it with the technology? Is it the poll worker training? There are a number of things that can contribute to this. And ultimately, at the end of the day, we want to share this wisdom with a number of counties. The last issue, which I'll highlight, and I know that there are some members of the Election Assistance Commission in the room. At least I saw one of them. Actually, I saw 2 of them. And the other one, I think, has a pass because he's doing something in California today. But one of the things that the Election Assistance Commission, which just come back into being with commissioners, might do is really look again at the voting technology. We had lots of new voting machines we put in place right after the Florida election, after the Help America Vote Act. Those machines are aging. They need to be replaced. And the process for developing better technology, for testing, for certifying them, is not what it should be. And one of the things the AC can do is to push forward in a short-term way to improve those standards. But we are also committed to working with a number of jurisdictions and both at the federal and state level to think about how we really improve the way in which we bring better technology, maybe off-the-shelf technology, into the polling place so that the polling place of the future in 10 years has technology that's helpful to voters more than it is today.
Great. One of the things I wanted to highlight, too, having just come off the county council, and I appreciate what you just said about how you work with local jurisdictions, is that Montgomery County Council in 2013 unanimously adopted a right to vote resolution in support of a constitutional right to vote. And I wanted to share that with you because what we came out with was some very interesting things, as well as establishing a task force which just reported out its work. And here are some of the highlights of what the task force recommended. It recommended same-day voter registration, automatic registration options, a get out the vote effort that would be sort of run by the government, looking at primary elections, because at the local level, the primary elections are midterm elections, and we have seen the numbers of voters really, really diminish over time. Ranked choice voting and instant runoff, and finally fair redistricting. And for this county to come up with those kinds of recommendations, and I have to say thank you to Fair Vote, because I know a lot of the work that Fair Vote has done in Montgomery County has really helped us land in the place where we are. The work that I'm doing now at the Center for Working Families is this on a national level, and Center for Working Families is working with some partner organizations to do some of this work at a national level. Our partners are Demos, The Color of Change, Planned Parenthood, and the Center for Popular Democracy. And what we're trying to establish is a voting rights strategy to fight for automatic voter registration across the country. And we know that this is not going to be an easy thing for us to win, and that's why it's really important at the municipal and local level that we begin to push for wins, big victories at the local level, because sometimes our federal partners do not necessarily move first, and sometimes we have to move first in a pretty big way at the local level, and we think that's really, really exciting. Listening to the speaker who just left the stage, I wanted to sort of focus a little bit on the demographic changes across the country, and coming from Montgomery County, one would find it really hard to believe that Montgomery County public school systems are majority minority, and the minority voting groups in the county are really, really growing. But when you look at who's elected, that is not what you see. And I think that the county council started to get really, really concerned that we have a large Latino population, a large African immigrant population, a large African American population. But when you look at who's elected, that is not reflected. And so when you talk about democracy, you're talking about it from lots of points of view. And I think that if we move to a system of automatic voter registration, we take the individuals having to jump through hoops to get themselves registered, and it becomes the government's responsibility to make sure every single citizen has the opportunity to vote, very much like a European model.
Maybe can I take the opportunity to,
Sure.
one, ask you a question to,
Sure.
to pick up on your experience as a local elected official. And this is, again, one of the issues we're working on is local election officials often feel like money for their running of elections is a pretty low priority. If you say, well, do you need another fireman or police or schools, those seem to be higher. And when you say, well, I need another voting machine, or I need more money for poll workers. So broadly, I guess, what would you say to local election officials when they're coming to their elected officials who control the purse strings broadly about what to do? And then I guess more specifically, certainly the case to be made for buying new equipment, which is really, it doesn't happen all the time. It happens every 10 years or so maybe, and it's usually a big purchase, whereas the regular running of elections has more regular expenses. What would you say to election officials, how they can effectively make the case to their people who control the purse strings?
I think that's a great question, and I think it's a narrative problem. Like, what is the story we're telling our elected officials? And I think it's really, really critically important that those folks you're talking about have a story to tell, like what we're hearing in this conference this today and throughout the year when we have these conversations, is like, why does it matter? And I think at the very basis of our democracy, if we don't have those kinds of tools available to make it accessible and easy for people to get to the ballot box and to vote their conscience, then I think we're missing the point. I remember when I first voted, I was 18, and my father actually took me to go vote, and I remember what the voting machines looked like. It was when they had those levers, and I remember my father saying, now, I'm not going to walk in there with you, but all you have to remember is push the D lever. And so I think these are the conversations that have to take place inside people's families. And I think the speaker before us talked about how once you vote 3 times, you're a voter. And you need to have people who understand the significance of that, and as well as elected officials who really need to understand the significance of making it as simple and easy as possible for people to get to a place to vote and to vote.
So that was my question. My comment is picking up on your point about automatic registration, and I think that's something that you have seen more in the news. Certainly, Oregon is now floating this concept of essentially the government taking responsibility for getting people registered rather than individuals taking that responsibility. And it's true that in many countries, it is the responsibility of government to come up with a census. I know our time is short, but I'm going to put it this way. Our commission certainly is very interested in registration issues, and I think politically these things are not always uncontroversial. And I think automatic registration probably will be popular in some places, not in others. What I think has fit a sweet spot that we found in our commission is there's a program, and I'm going to give lots of credit to the Pew Charitable Trust for starting this project called the ERIC Project, where states can join, it's voluntary, and they essentially send in their voter list, their DMV lists into this very sophisticated computer system, which is quite secure, but ultimately shares data across a lot of states and then sends back to the states, hey, here's a list of people who we think live in your district, they're eligible, but they're not registered. So you should go and reach out to them in some way. So the states are required to send a letter or to find a way to be in touch. But also, here's a list of where we think the duplicates are. People are on in this state and that state, or people have changed their name, or people have moved and their address is wrong. And the sweet spot there is it's still not automatic. It doesn't force anybody to register. It doesn't make that the default, but it definitely opens up the knowledge of who's not registered and gives a little touch to them. But it also deals with questions that are probably more salient on the right about accuracy of lists, and really gives us much better information for finding ways to make those lists, the complete list of the people who should be able to vote. So that's something that our commission did endorse, as well as another cross-state data sharing program. It has elements of what you're saying, but it was I'd say something of a political compromise, but has some salience.
This is the tip of an iceberg of a key conversation. But so, John, how do people find out more about what the next steps are for the commission and for you?
The Bipartisan Policy Center at bipartisanpolicy.org has a number of things going. Our Democracy Project has one of its big projects as the President's Commission on Election Administration, as well as some work more broadly on democracy issues under the Commission for Political Reform.
And Valerie, Center for Working Families?
The Center for Working Families.org, and we hope to be doing a lot more of this work, hopefully with fair vote.
There we go.
So
good. Well, thank you.
Me.
Great. Thank you.
I just wanted to mention on the youth participation, our home city did lower the voting age to 16, and now Hyattsville has next door. But we've had 2 elections with it, and the number of 16 and 17-year-olds that voted in Tacoma Park in those 2 elections was more than all 18 to 30-year-olds combined. Also that Louisiana became the state that came closest to an automatic registration process last year for young people. So these ideas are moving in different places around the country.